I grew up in a family of historians. My uncle, Philip Foner, was a very prominent historian. My father, Jack Foner, also a historian. I liked history a lot in school, but actually when I went to college at Columbia, where I teach now, I actually wanted to be a scientist, an astronomer. And I spent my first 2 years studying physics, astronomy, calculus, etc. It was only when, I guess you might almost say, I reached the limits of my ability there and found I wasn't making as much progress. And then I took a course with Professor James Shenton, a great legendary teacher here, on the Civil War era, year-long seminar on the coming of the Civil War Reconstruction. And that, I think, finding an inspiring teacher like that was what made me think that I wanted to be a historian. I'd always been interested in history, but wanting to be a historian didn't really happen until my junior year of college here. What was inspiring about Shenton as a teacher? What is it that makes a teacher inspiring in the first place? You know, I've thought a lot about that over the years, obviously. I think the first thing is the passion for the subject. He really cared about it. He somehow conveyed that to his students. He thought history was really important, and he somehow made us think history was really important. Also, Shenton had a way of linking history with the present, making it now. I was in college in the early 60s, and the civil rights movement was reaching its peak, and these issues of slavery, anti-slavery, race in American history, the Civil War, Reconstruction, you didn't need to be that profound to see the relevance of those things to the world we were living in. You picked up your newspaper, you opened the door, and these issues were right in front of you. And so somehow Shenton made us understand that you couldn't really appreciate what was going on in the society without looking back and seeing the deep history of where this came from, particularly the history of slavery and the slavery controversy and the civil rights struggles of the 19th century. So I think it's that combination of passion for the subject and a way of making it relevant to the present that really made him a great teacher. Well, of course, at Columbia, the most important figure in the history department was Richard Hofstadter. I was fortunate enough in my senior year to have Hofstadter basically supervise my what was in effect a senior thesis, a research project on the old Free Soil Party in 1848, so that's fairly obscure. But and then later on I went to have, Hofstadter became the supervisor of my doctoral thesis when I was in graduate school. So Hofstadter was a model of, you know, a brilliant historian, a brilliant writer. Hofstadter made a very, really emphasized the importance of writing with clarity, writing for an audience outside the academic world, not just writing, doing a lot of research, obviously, but not just writing for an internal scholarly audience. And in other words, he was a public intellectual, a term which didn't quite exist then, but would come to be very prominent. So I think Hofstadter, as just so prominent, he'd won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, his works were bestsellers, he had helped to shape the so-called consensus school, which was dominant, although beginning to fray at the edges at that time. And then just as a great writer, I think was a sort of model. Now the funny thing is, he was not a model of a teacher. Hofstadter didn't really care that much about teaching. He told me once, I'm a writer, that's what I do, I teach to make a living. So it was somehow this combination of Shenton and Hofstadter. Shenton, the person who was not really a productive scholar, he didn't write a lot of books, but he had this wonderful classroom presence, and Hofstadter, the great scholar. Somehow merging those together was the sort of model one might want to aspire to. Well, by the time I became a graduate student and was working on my first book, the Ideology of the Republican Party Before the Civil War, a strong influence on me was Eugene Genovese, who in '65 published The Political Economy of Slavery, which really helped to transform the study of the Old South and the study of the coming of the Civil War, reintroducing, so to speak, the old irrepressible conflict idea of 2 very distinct societies in a headlong conflict with one another, and putting this idea of ideology back onto the agenda of historical analysis. Now, of course, that book was also very much a Hofstadter book. It's interested in political culture, political ideas. Those are the kinds of things Hofstadter wrote about so brilliantly. But I think Genovese added an edge, because since Hofstadter was still in this consensus mold, which didn't really enable you to understand the Civil War all that well, it was Genovese who gave a different view. Slavery was not just a little aberration. It was the foundation of a distinct society which grew up from the colonial period into the 19th century and set the South on a path of development quite different from that of the North, and really became, that's your explanation of the coming of the Civil War in a nutshell. Even though much of Genovese's analysis has been challenged by subsequent historians, I think that fundamental point remains a very, very good starting point for thinking about the coming of the Civil War. Of course, Hofstadter came out of the 1930s and had even been in the Communist Party very, very briefly. He knew Marxist analysis, even though he moved beyond it or rejected it in favor of other ways of thinking about American society. But I think with Hofstadter, the education I got at Columbia was a very traditional one at that time. It was political history, intellectual history, diplomatic history. But politics defined broadly as political culture, political ideas, not just electoral politics. There's a lot that was ignored. I mean, the social history revolution was beginning to percolate, but that was not reflected at Columbia at all until much, much later. But nonetheless, the kinds of issues that Hofstadter raised, in an odd sort of way, are still the issues I deal with in my writing about politics and society is really what it's about. The relationship of politics writ large and the evolution of American society. And the Civil War era, I think, is a wonderful place to examine that. But Genovese gave it a different edge of looking at the sort of social foundations, the labor foundations, two different labor systems, slave labor and free labor, as the generative aspect of the different political ideas that developed in the 19th century. Well, we always say, and I say in my classes, the present gives you your questions. And certainly the Civil Rights Movement threw onto our agenda as students of history the question, where did this come from? Where did the racial tensions in the society come from? Where did this uprising of people demanding their rights come from? How do you explain how American society got into this enormous crisis? The consensus school could not explain that, since it was based on the idea that throughout American history, Americans have basically agreed on fundamental values. But here, people were tearing the society apart on the basis of differing fundamental values. And Hofstadter himself understood this. In fact, in his book on the progressive historians, written a little later, he says toward the end, the Civil War can never be explained within a consensus mode, so people have to move beyond that in some ways. But yeah, it was, I as a student, others took part in civil rights activities. My brother went to Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of 1964. I was, as a college student, picketing Woolworth's stores here in sympathy with people who were sitting in the South, in Woolworth's, black, young people demanding to be served at the lunch counters. So the interconnection of history and the present was very, very much on our minds. It opened up these issues which had been considerably neglected in the study of American history up to that point. I graduated from Columbia in 1963. And then I was fortunate enough to get what they call a Kellett Fellowship, which sends you to Oxford or Cambridge for 2 years. So I went and studied basically European history, British history in Oxford. I came back in '65. I was very lucky to be given the opportunity to do graduate work either here at Columbia or at Yale. So I had to decide whether I was going to work with Hofstadter or C. Vann Woodward. You can't go wrong with a choice like that, right? For mostly personal reasons, I was getting married. My wife had a job in New York. I decided to do it at Columbia. But, by then, the civil rights movement had either peaked or moved off in other directions, and it was the anti-war movement which had transformed the society, or the campuses. And the 60s had hit between '63 and '65. And you know, there was a very big anti-war movement on campus, and off campus, and I took part in that, absolutely, like many, many young people. I was nervous about getting drafted. You know, I had a very high or low, I mean, number for the draft, which meant I was in great danger of being drafted. I never was, but you know, that kind of turmoil also fed into our thinking about history. And particularly, it helped to undermine a very, how shall I put it, you know, kind of milquetoast view of American history that you know, it's just a story of the progress of liberty and helping people around the world. And somehow, how did we get to this point where we were waging war with 500,000 soldiers against a small country that we knew virtually nothing about, and you know, and outraging much of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So the notion of American empire began to get into discourse about history, which hadn't really been there before. But yeah, I was also a graduate student. I was not, you know, by then I was too old to be a real radical. It was the undergraduates who were the cutting edge of the Columbia uprising, or whatever you want to call it, of 1968. I was writing my doctoral dissertation then. I mean, I was also out on campus seeing what was going on, but you know, it was a very unusual and strange moment, but I think it was dynamic. It was inspiring. You know, you were living, who was it who said, you know, I don't want to be cursed living in interesting times, but interesting times can be very interesting, even though, and inspiring, even though they can also lead to a lot of disasters. Well, you know, Shenton was the only scholar at a place like Columbia at that time who assigned W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America in his class, all 700 some odd pages of it. Now, I actually had met Du Bois. Du Bois was a friend of my parents, and I'd heard about Du Bois's writings on Reconstruction, but reading that book, I would say that book had more influence on me over the long haul than any other thing we read in Shenton's year-long seminar, because it, not only because of the picture it gave, scholars at that time were still locked into a very old-fashioned and I think very mythological view of Reconstruction as a period just of corruption and misgovernment. Du Bois gave you a positive view of it, but his final chapter, if you got there, The Propaganda of History, is a magnificent, what shall I say, critique of the historical profession and how it has just mishandled the whole history of Reconstruction. And Shenton really drove home that last chapter and what you might almost call the responsibility of the historian. You know, not to falsify history or not to warp history to serve a current moment, but to be aware of the consequences of the history that you're writing. And these people like Dunning and others were not perhaps totally aware of the uses that were made of their history for a long time in bolstering the Jim Crow system of the South and the white supremacist system of the country in the first half of the 20th century. So it was another example of that history matters. It's not just, you know, as we call it, academic, so to speak.